1. Evelyn's bed. There's a brass bed in the back bedroom on the second floor of the Marston family home. Into it, through the tender agony of a mother not unaccustomed to this process, Evelyn Marston had been born many years ago. And while she was not the first to meet the world over the tarnished bars of that footboard, she was, indeed, the last. And in her adult life, she considered the bed to be a haunted object. This girl, the youngest and only unmarried daughter of the family, had always been a little superstitious. It's the nature of all romantic, trembling souls like hers to prefer a worldview which leaves a little grist to the imagination. And as such, she considered the greater world uncertain and its matters to be unsettled at this time. There was no mysterious impetus towards this inclination other than that she believed it, and found that life was more interesting that way. On her morning walks, Ellen would scry strange signs of favor in the world around her, blessings in an apple blossom which fell at her feet, or advice in the murmur of the leaves. The obscure omens which would trouble her appeared in no index or guidebook. She simply felt them, and trusted to her intuition with her characteristic lack of doubt. The house that she grew up in naturally blended into her superstition. A big, creaky frame house, 4 generations old, it was well-founded, cluttered, yet not unclean, and much loved. It bustled with many happy lives, but in its Victorian nooks and crannies, there were certain shadows, whispers. It seemed to Evelyn that invisible things would get stuck in her house and couldn't find their way out again. She had accepted this without consideration at some point in her early life before thought really began. She was nominally religious, as most were in the time of her youth, and the 2 spiritual schemes which ruled her life never seemed, in her opinion, to conflict all that much. She went to church each Sunday morning, and each Sunday afternoon she performed her careful rituals of salt and safekeeping. These 2 acts seemed to her to be the greater and the lesser expressions of a single unifying humility. And she kept the back bedroom closed up after she inherited the property for the clear and inarguable reason that it was haunted. Haunted by whom? A lady once inquired over tea and a lace collar with a pleasant, derisive agreeableness. What a silly question, Evelyn replied, and sighed for the simplicity of her companion. Evelyn slept in the bed exactly 3 times in her life, and never without duress. Here is the story of the first. When she was a girl, her parents bought themselves a new oak bed frame. Rather than heave out the ancient brass bedstead down the rickety stairs, they left it where it stood and fixed up another room down the hall. Their old bedroom sat empty, unless there were guests, and something strange happened to it after they had moved out. Before, it had been a sort of state chamber, a serious place that smelled of wood and perfume. The children usually only visited it in cases of nightmare or injury, and that gave it a sort of fundamental direness in their eyes. Now, without the anchor of the parents themselves, their kicked-off shoes and damp towels, the room darkened and became a wanting, hungry place. It still hung thick with the authority of a parent's bedroom, but the comforting reality of their flesh was gone. Evelyn perceived it as a void, a vacuum that sucked air out of the hallway, and she would snap the door shut anytime she saw it sit open. That first night that she had spent there had been filled with all of the primordial wordless terror of childhood. She had been exiled from her usual shared room because her sister Vera had a bad flu. With great misgivings, Evelyn stood silently in the hallway and allowed her mother to pile fresh sheets into her arms, wondering how she could change this arrangement. She had not found a route before her mother steered her in the bedroom, kissed her head, and shut the door behind her. And a strange sensation settled over Evelyn then. It was like she had become suspended in herself or offset somehow, like a drawing on tracing paper pulled just slightly off of its subject. The room was dim and quiet, undisturbed. She saw, heard, smelled nothing unusual, but something about the place felt wrong, heavy. Anytime she moved, she felt like she was pushing through air that was just a bit thicker than usual. Arms laden with her paltry pile of linen, the child in her white shift moved with a sleepwalker's slowness to the bedside and paused there, though she didn't know why. It felt as though some unknown and amorphous authority had ordered her to stillness, and she ought not disobey. The darkness was grainy and seemed to be moving, shifting constantly around her, creating indistinct shapes in the heaps of clutter, watching faces, blinking eyes. It seemed too terrible to try to make up the enormous bed with the sheets in her arms, and so she let them fall. She tucked herself into the musty duvet which had sat untouched for months. The darkness seethed, a foaming, snickering mass. It pressed down onto the bed, onto her. Miserably, she tried to ignore this and fix herself a place to sleep, tucking herself into the huge expanse of the bed that she had been born in. It was too big to offer much comfort, and the mattress, chilled by the draft, was cold. Evelyn realized that she was frightened, and that gooseflesh prickled all over her arms and her legs. She wanted her mother to come back, with some forgotten thing, smiling, or just to hear her familiar step in the hallway, going to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. The nearness of her would be enough to be rescued from the strange nightmare of this bedroom. She thought about getting up and going to the door herself, or even trying to run upstairs to the attic room with Vera, sick as she was, but that was too far away and it seemed impossible. Just as she gloomily accepted this, she heard a soft creak from the other side of the door. At first, relief washed over her. Of course, it was her mother, just like she'd hoped, and there would be her beloved face, warm milk and the friendly yellow light of their kitchen. Evelyn waited to hear the familiar soft rap of her mother's knuckles on the door, sharpened slightly by the garnet ring she always wore. And then the lowing call of her voice, like always, intuitive, homey expectations. But nothing came. Evelyn pushed herself up onto her arms, waiting. And as the silence continued to elapse, the calm which had bloomed in her stomach began to curdle, souring back into the same dread. With a certainty that deepened every moment the knock didn't come, she knew it wasn't her mother outside. There was a gentle light that came up that hallway from the kitchen stairs. In it, in the narrow space underneath the door, Evelyn now saw the muddy movement of a shadow. It was hesitant, slow, like someone who was laying their step delicately, trying hard not to be heard, not to make the floor creak again. That instinctual part of Evelyn's mind was stung and buzzed again, not like people move in the hallways of their own houses. Her breath started to puff hard against her chest, and her face hardened into a mask of fear. Unconsciously, her hands twisted to the old duvet cover. The step creaked once more, Again. Closer. And Evelyn heard a little noise whimper out of her mouth. It seemed impossible to her that someone strange, someone that she didn't know, could come to her room and open the door. Yet the certainty had grabbed a hold of her and swollen until it filled her whole being and threatened to burst her apart. However impossible it was for the door to move and show her a stranger, it swung open all the same. In the soft sunlight of that back bedroom, Evelyn lay silent and frozen in terror. She stared with wide, round eyes at the dark figure which loomed in the open space of her doorway. She could barely even see it. The outlines of its shape blended with the warm darkness of the hall, swayed and shifted with the shadows. The specter and the child hung transfixed in their moment of dilated quiet. With the bold certainty of instinct, Evelyn knew two things. She knew that if this thing touched her, something awful would happen. And she knew with conviction that she was alone. The house where her whole family had gone to sleep was now empty and cold, and it held only her and this. The sepia darkness hung suspended. Other children may have screamed, and she almost expected to, but she found that her throat was reedy and impotent, empty of air, incapable of sound. Every breath was a hitching gasp which caught in her mouth as she willed the shadow to dissipate. But it wouldn't. There was something terrible about knowing that it was looking at her. The girl was being exposed to a grim world, hidden until now behind a grassy ocean of tree houses and bee stings. It's easy to misremember after childhood how it is to negotiate a reality that will not stop expanding and enriching itself with its manifold meanings. Beyond the rim of this ever-moving border, there are many obscure shadows waiting to be apprehended like this one. It presents a great task to each of us to create our worlds, and the first terror which threatens it is the worst. Have you forgotten? And so Evelyn was forced to live a moment like this for the first time, and forced to find some sort of grit in her soul to withstand it. She understood with her natural cleverness that stories like this do not end here. Half-realized images flowed in her, but the scene did not. Had time slowed down, or had she? Something comes after this, she knew, but it wouldn't come, and time hung silent and still. There was world enough for her eyes to begin to adjust to the new light, and to see that the dark shape in her doorway had a white clock of hair, backlit. And backlit also was a long white gown, trimmed with lace. The face was in darkness until it stepped closer, and then Evelyn saw that the old woman was weeping, and down her wrinkled face a river of tears ran. She perceived with no understanding that this woman was staring at her with her own reflected fear, that her face was twisted with a pitiable misery, and Evelyn heard the strangled gulp of an ungraceful sob. And suddenly the doorway was filled with light and the figure of her mother, who was waking her up for school. She found her youngest daughter pale and sweating, and her fears of her sister's flu being contagious were confirmed. Evelyn spent a long time considering the events of the bedroom. She was old enough to have heard ghost stories and understood that this had the appearance of one. She sat quietly in the window seat of her room and drew the vision patiently, wrinkles and long robe and the doorframe behind it for reference. It was not a good sketch, and it had some of its unease held within it. Afterwards, with her pencil still poised on the page, Evelyn fell to studying it with a silent resolve, until the light through the window started to fail and she jumped slightly, as though time had gone by without her noticing. There just wasn't anything else to be done about it. It was a ghost and her house was haunted. Her siblings listened with vague unease to their sister as she stated with perfect certainty that the house was haunted by an old woman in a lace nightgown. She relayed the tale over breakfast with fidelity, and it was much shorter than mine. But before she told about the crying, her mother felt a chill of remembered fear and snapped at her daughter to be quiet and say her prayers. Evelyn's thoughtful brown eyes lingered on her mother's 10-step shoulders for a long moment before she bowed her head obediently. The second time that she had slept in the haunted room, it had been a challenge to herself. 16, she was now sure that all those years ago, her anxiety had simply gotten the best of her, and that the ghost had just been a childish nightmare. And so she set out to kill that memory and accomplish another part of growing up. Cousins were in town, and someone needed to sleep in the dusty spare room. It wouldn't be right to put a guest there. The timing was perfect. The house was noisy and bustling, full of matter-of-fact annoyances and screaming children. Evelyn agreed with a smile to sleep in the back bedroom that night, and she didn't mention memories of ghosts at dinner. As she approached the door to that room later that night, she tried to walk briskly down the hallway to keep herself from thinking, and didn't pause when she passed through. The perimeter of family junk in the spare room had accumulated, and now it hemmed the old bedstead in a bit more closely on each side. She stepped delicately over a fallen tennis racket and tried not to feel the heavy pressure on her skin again. She made the bed up fresh, and she could smell the sunny clover of the back garden in the blankets. Again, she felt like she was moving through thick air, through just a little resistance. But she refused to notice this. She thought with resolve that she would be quite fine as she settled into sleep. This had been the worst of the 2 nights. Evelyn settled into her plumped pillows and heard nothing strange in the soupy air of the quiet room. With her usual ease, she fell asleep this time, but somehow it seemed that she misremembered the way. She did not go into the forgotten, easy dreamscape which envelops us all each evening, as mysterious as it is familiar. She fell back, past the entry to that place and somewhere deeper. In this place, her body became like the body we occupy when we play back our own memories, a first-person viewpoint, without flesh to support it, without feeling, without anything more than the concept of it. And in this fashion, Evelyn felt a cool, flowing sensation, sluicing all around her, and a perpetually deepening pressure. It could be likened to sinking slowly underwater, yet there was no sensation of moisture, only cold. The borders of what she felt were confused, undetermined, a frightened cloud of self trying to understand its own being. What edges she had were receding back towards a fundamental center, from which the feeble warmth, her only possession, was slowly wicking away. The cold was about to consume her. There was an attempt to draw breath or help. The impulse raced, but found no mouth or hand with which to seek its own relief. She knew one thing only, and that was that she was not sleeping. It felt like nothing at all ever had, like nothing that she could describe. Once, when she tried just to think it to herself, she translated the feeling to sliding down a funnel of draining water, spinning, choking, drowning, heading towards some destination which itself was only the mouth of the next place, dark and cold. When she awoke, she lay still far longer than was usual for her, trying to understand the nightmare. When she raised her hand up before her face, she made a faint noise of surprise, like she expected it to be translucent, or maybe not even there at all. "Again?" A deep voice said this, a man's but not her father's, there beside her, just beside her by the bed. Evelyn felt frozen again. Again she felt she could not, or by some unknown rule should not move. But her nature was more curious than obedient, and she was braver and older this time. Something about the terror of the night before had drained her of her potential to fear and left interest in its place. Slowly her eyes rolled to the sound, to the sensation of the presence, and she saw a man with kindly eyes, whose face was mostly mustache, peering at her over a splotchy work shirt patched over by suspenders. By then, her mother had been dead for a few years, but in the silence of that morning she heard her footstep in the corridor, the cadence of her familiar tuneless humming. She heard a knock, sharpened slightly, perhaps by a garnet ring, and the reverse of her previous fright was performed. In a broken child's voice, she heard herself call, "Mama?" The door swung open and showed her the empty hallway, still dim in the pre-dawn. There was something heartbreakingly ordinary about it, like it was from a faraway, foreign place. Evelyn looked around. Other than herself, the room and the hall were empty. She inherited the house at 26. At this time, she'd been educated, traveled, and unsuccessfully romanced on a few occasions, and had now determined to become a lifelong spinster. Part of her preparations for this had involved meditating on the proper way to manage living in a haunted house. She felt that she had a good shot at it, if she only managed her head and her chances. The first day she arrived, she was wearing her lucky yellow dress, cinched tightly with a bright white belt and clasped with an enameled daisy, also lucky. She had determined that costume would be the first step. The second was the ordering of the entry of her possessions. First must come the small blue velvet case, carried alone from the long beige sedan and in through the porch in the entryway. There, Evelyn paused and breathed deeply the familiar air of her childhood home. From the open front door behind her sang a chorus of birds in the blooming magnolia tree. Often she'd scraped her knee on the curving, sinuous branches there. She smelled the strong perfume of the blossoms on the breeze which came in to ruffle the silk scarf around her hair. A faint sense of welcome strengthened her, and she pressed forward down the hall and to the right. Straight away, she placed the blue case on the dining room table, unsnapped the latches, and arranged her objects of power in a protective crescent there. There was a little broken hummingbird swing, a piece of quartz with an old dauby smear of her blood, an eagle statuette that she'd bought at a penny store, some ivory wrapped in sweet grass. She poured coarse salt in the prettiest cut crystal bowl that she could find, set it in the center of all of these things, and pushed her fingers into the cool grains. She tried to sigh, but found that she was holding her breath, and the exhalation when it came was ragged and old. Evelyn's eyes opened in surprise and then closed again, pinched thinking. It had been her intention to purify herself, to create a gleaming crystal aura which could not be permeated by the death and the silence which hung like drapes in the curtainless back room. It seemed to her that if she could create a field of rightness and sunshine around her body, then she could navigate all regions of the home in safety. But instead, she felt the same silence creeping back into her from without, the opposing effect. Her magic worked backwards today. She auspiced accurately, and with crisp, slightly frightened movements, she stood, smoothed her skirt, and left the room. It is a natural human instinct to try to protect the self from uncertainty and the obscure signs of an as yet unapprehended threat. One doesn't need to understand risk in order to feel it in proximity. And there was something that followed Evelyn. A certainty of a potential horror not yet manifested. This was the clearest way that she had ever managed to think it. And the closest that she could arrive to a location of the threat that she sensed. The home of the horrible truth waiting to whisper itself was the back bedroom on the second floor. As a young woman, Evelyn was a self-satisfied and vivacious heiress of a modest family fortune. She was disinclined to work and saw no need to. Nor was she a person who found herself moping around movie theaters and bars looking for a date or a conversation. Instead, she found her own company more than pleasing. Like many young people who settled exactly where they grew up, she kept a circle of friends that she liked to a greater or lesser degree, more out of a sense of obligation than anything else. Her girlfriends and their babies came over for tea and left lipstick and spit up on her cloth napkins. Around the holidays, all the Marston siblings liked to come and hang around, but generally she was left and kept to herself. Alone in the house, the walls started to clutter with her strange and imaginative paintings. The teacups that she left squirreled into desktops and bookcases began to mold over. At some point in time, there came to be 2 cats in the house, who she left uncollared and unclaimed generally, though she left food out on her patio every night. And Ellen got to know her ghosts. She found that inheriting a long-held family home is a very strange thing. All of the Marstons, since her great-grandfather's siblings, had been born and raised in that big house, and even though they had mostly died or been dead for many years, somehow she still had all of their things. Journals, crayon drawings, receipts, hat boxes, brushes, photographs, all stuffed into every desk drawer, or on top of every bookshelf, going back sometimes 3 generations. Each object exactly where the hands of some relation had left it last. Once, even in the well-used kitchen, in the back of a drawer housing, she found a yellowed scrap of linen, half-stitched into a handkerchief patterned in violets. There was still a needle pinned neatly through. It seemed strange to her every time she found one of these artifacts, like she had discovered a lost object that ought to be returned, or somehow intruded into someone else's personal space. She spent most of her time in a few rooms on the first floor, and only took up part of the back of the house, where she kept the new and fresh things that she called her own. It occurred to her occasionally that one day she would leave these things behind her, too, and then she'd frown and switch on the radio. Years passed kindly for Evelyn Marston, and when she was 32, she had the house painted light blue with cream-colored trimmings. The painters were there for 3 days, striving to access the many planes and surfaces of the organically expanded home place. Tranquil over her teacup, hearing footsteps on the roof and indolent chatter through the porch door, Evelyn felt the resigned patience of the dentist's chair, waiting for the healthy work to be completed. It was strange to have the old place swarmed by strangers, but oddly pleasant, something like showing off. If she had heard them talking about the strange old woman inside the deteriorating mansion, she gave no visible indication. When the foreman came inside to collect the second half of his payment, she slid her opaque sunglasses over her eyes before she received him. It had become a necessary step, one of her many private procedures. Her eyes, she felt, were entirely too vulnerable, and it was not healthy to show them to strangers. Standing on the sidewalk outside, observing the home contentedly, it appeared to her to be an extension of the clear blue sky which hung over it. You have probably determined that Evelyn Marston was a great one for colors, symbols, and analogies, for the type of intuitive knowledge that clips along easily and doesn't circle back to question itself. And this was her peculiar genius for living happily and well. And so it did not disturb her that once inside the house, all was still as it had been for many years, that is to say, cluttered, musty, and increasingly patched over. Still, just like forever, long dusty bars of sunlight fell dreamily through thick panes of colored glass and warmed the floor where they fell. Humming, she strolled happily over the thick faded carpets heaped and overlapped throughout the rambling house on something of a personal tour. She felt strengthened by the fresh paint to face all of these quiet, portentous spaces, as she felt she occasionally should. Opening one onto the other with their big wooden door frames and thick arches, the more remote chambers sometimes looked to her like rooms in a museum, and not a place that she owned. She wandered prosaically through the library and into the sunroom, where the better part of 2 centuries' gardening equipment lay under sifted sheaves of spilled potting soil. She had a little space cleared here, a white iron chair and table that sat innocently among all the tarnished copper, bright against brass and leaves. There was her favorite little porcelain teacup, lost for 2 months. Its inside stained red, like the throat of a lily. Bright-eyed Evelyn went towards it, but hesitated when she saw the curl of paper sitting in the saucer. The stationery was her own, torn, yellowed. In a straggling, painful-looking hand were written the words, "Twice yet, twice more. Have faith." Her favorite teacup shattered on the stones at her feet. We will see Evelyn again, soon. For now, we do have other friends to encounter.